you are standing on the edge of the world. Behind you, a continent stretches back further than you can imagine. Forests, rivers, animals you have never seen before. Ahead of you, open water. Dark, deep, endless. And somewhere out there, beyond the horizon, something you cannot see, but somehow know is there. You have never done this before. No human has. It is 65,000 years ago, and you are about to do something that will not be repeated anywhere else on Earth for another 20,000 years. How did you get here? Not just to this coastline, but to this moment, this decision? And how, without a map, without a compass, without any written record of what lay beyond that water, did you and your mob manage to cross 90 kilometers of open ocean and reach the oldest continent on Earth? That is what we are going to figure out today. Start with the geography, because it matters enormously. 65,000 years ago, the world looked nothing like it does now. The last ice age had locked so much water into glaciers and ice sheets that global sea levels were roughly 65 meters lower than today. That changes everything. Land masses that are now separated by ocean were either joined or much closer together. The continent we now call Sunderland, a vast shelf connecting what is today mainland Southeast Asia with Borneo, Sumatra, and Java, was almost entirely above water. You could walk from what is now Vietnam to what is now Bali without getting your feet wet. But here is the thing. Even with sea levels that low, even with Sunderland above water, and a string of islands stepping southward through what we now call Wallacea, that cluster of islands between Bali and the Australian landmass, there was still a gap, a stretch of deep, open, unpredictable ocean that could not be walked, waded, or swum. Researchers estimate it at somewhere between 70 and 90 kilometers at its narrowest crossing point. The biogeographer Alfred Russel Wallace identified this zone in the 19th century. We still call it the Wallace Line. It marks the deepest oceanic trench in the region, water so deep it stayed ocean even when sea levels dropped. No land bridge ever formed here, not even at the height of the Ice Age. That gap is the puzzle. To cross it, your ancestors needed watercraft. Think about what that means. This was not a matter of following coastlines, of hugging the shore and watching the land shift beside you. This was a deliberate, planned, open water crossing. You needed something to float on. You needed to understand currents and winds at least well enough to survive them. You needed enough food and fresh water to last the crossing. And critically, you needed to know, or at least believe strongly enough to risk your life on it, that there was something worth crossing to. The oldest confirmed evidence for human presence in Australia comes from Madjedbebe, a rock shelter on Mirarr country in the Northern Territory. Geochronologist Richard Burt Roberts and his team used a dating technique called optically stimulated luminescence, which measures the last time individual sand grains were exposed to sunlight to place human occupation of that site at approximately 65,000 years ago. Stone tools, ground edge axes, grinding stones, red ochre. Evidence not just of presence, but of a functioning, sophisticated human culture. 65,000 years ago. That number is extraordinary. It means your ancestors arrived in Australia tens of thousands of years before modern humans reached Europe. Before the cave paintings of Lascaux. Before Homo sapiens had settled most of Central Asia. The people who crossed that ocean and reached Madjedbebe were among the most adventurous, most capable humans who had ever lived, and we are only just beginning to understand how they did it. So what did the watercraft look like? Here is where we have to be honest about what we know and what we do not. No physical watercraft from 65,000 years ago has survived. Wood rots, bark disintegrates, lashed reeds dissolve into the sediment. We have the tools, but not the vessels. What we have instead is inference, careful, evidence-based reasoning built on archaeology, experimental voyaging, and deep knowledge of the materials and technologies available to people in this region at that time. Archaeologist Clive Gamble, whose work on global human dispersal has shaped how we understand this period, argues that the crossing was not accidental. The sheer distance, 70 to 90 kilometers of open water, rules out a scenario where a group of people simply drifted on a log and got lucky. A crossing that size requires deliberate navigation. It requires people who understood their environment well enough to look at an ocean horizon and make a calculated decision. The most likely candidates for the vessels are bamboo rafts. Bamboo is extraordinarily buoyant, grows abundantly across Southeast Asia, and can be lashed together with plant fiber to create a remarkably stable floating platform. Experimental archaeology has demonstrated that even a simple bamboo raft can support multiple people and their supplies. The materials were available. The skills to work them, splitting, lashing, shaping, were within the technological reach of people who were already making complex ground-edge stone tools at Madjedbebe. But the vessel is only part of the problem. Navigation is the other. Look up on a clear night from Wallace Line, the island chain between Bali and Australia, and you will see the same sky your ancestors saw. The Southern Cross, the Milky Way, the movement of stars across the horizon. Archaeoastronomer Dwayne Hamaker has documented in detail how Aboriginal Australians developed some of the most sophisticated astronomical knowledge of any culture on Earth, knowledge that was encoded in songlines, in oral tradition, in ceremony, passed down across thousands of generations. The deep roots of that knowledge almost certainly stretch back to the crossing itself. Stars gave direction, but there were other cues too. Ocean swells carry directional information if you know how to read them, a skill still practiced by Pacific Islander navigators today, and almost certainly shared by the peoples of Wallace Line. The smell of land. The behavior of birds. Clouds that form over land masses and stay relatively fixed even when the land itself is below the horizon. These are not primitive guesses. They are sophisticated, accumulated, tested knowledge systems built by people who spent their lives at the edge of the ocean. Peter Veth, archaeologist and specialist in Australian arid zone prehistory, has argued that the people who made this crossing were not struggling survivors at the limits of their ability. They were accomplished, adaptable humans at the height of their capabilities, people whose entire way of life demanded spatial awareness, resource management, and the capacity to read environmental cues with extraordinary precision. The ocean crossing was not a desperate gamble. It was the logical extension of skills they had been honing for thousands of years. Now imagine the crossing itself. You leave at dawn, when the winds are typically calmer, and the stars are still visible on the western horizon for orientation. The raft is loaded people, food, water carried in bark containers or animal skins. The island behind you shrinks slowly. Then it disappears. For a period of time that might be measured in days depending on currents, winds, and the size of the group, there is nothing around you but water. This is the moment that most people, when they try to imagine it, find hardest to comprehend. Not the building of the raft. Not even the navigation. The moment when the last piece of land drops below the horizon and you are in the open ocean with no visible reference point in any direction. The psychological demands of that moment are almost incomprehensible from our modern vantage point. We live in a world layered with maps, GPS, satellite imagery. We always know, somewhere in the back of our minds, exactly where we are. Your ancestors had none of that, and they kept going. When land appeared on the southern horizon, a dark smudge, then a line of coast, then the unmistakable green of vegetation, the feeling must have been something close to what early European explorers described when they sighted land after months at sea. Relief. Vindication. The confirmation that the risk was worth it. But here is the counterintuitive part. We tend to think of this crossing as a single event. A group of bold individuals who took a chance and happened to make it. But the genetic evidence tells a different story. Population geneticist Alan Cooper and colleagues, analysing ancient DNA from Aboriginal Australians, found evidence suggesting that the founding population of Australia was substantial, not a handful of survivors clinging to a raft, but a population large enough to carry real genetic diversity. Some researchers estimate the founding group at several hundred individuals at minimum, possibly more. That means this was not one crossing. It was almost certainly multiple crossings, perhaps over an extended period. A systematic, deliberate, organized effort to move people and culture across that ocean gap. A maritime tradition robust enough to carry not just individuals but communities. Think about what that tells us about the people who did it. Think about the social organization required, the planning, the boats, the knowledge systems, the cultural structures that motivated group after group to look south across that ocean and decide to go. We stand in the shadow of those decisions every time we stand on Australian soil. The evidence at Lake Mungo in New South Wales, where Mungo Man and Mungo Lady were discovered, the oldest human remains found outside Africa, dated to approximately 40,000 years ago, shows us what those founding people had already become by the time they reached the interior of the continent. Ritual burial. Red ochre sprinkled over the dead. A cremation that is the oldest known deliberate cremation in human history. These are not the acts of people barely surviving. These are the acts of a culture in full flower, a culture that had already been developing on this continent for 25,000 years by the time Mungo Lady was laid to rest. It all flows back to that crossing. 65,000 years ago, a group of people stood at the edge of Wallace Line and looked south. They built something that could float. They read the stars and the swells and the birds. They crossed 90 kilometres of open ocean in the dark and the heat and the uncertainty. And when they arrived, they did not stop. They spread across an entire continent. They learned its rhythms, its resources, its dangers, and its gifts. They built a civilization that would last 65,000 years longer than any other continuous human culture on Earth. You are standing on the edge of the world, and your ancestors jumped.